Good morning and welcome to my garden. It's very crisp this morning. I'm feeling a little bit cold out here. This morning I'd like to show you my worm farm. This is my worm farm. It's hiding behind a structure I made to keep the sun off it in the morning and on the north, because we get strong sun coming from the north in winter. It also has a shelter on the west. And my worm farm is what they call a can of worms. I've managed to buy one and find another one at a second-hand shop. So I have 6 layers on it at the moment. So you can see each layer sits upon the next. It has a tap at the bottom that drains liquid out. And I have a couple of layers on top to prevent it overheating when the sun is directly above it in summer. So my worm farm gets everything. Everything from the kitchen, eggshells. These bananas were not eaten and they've gone yuck. I've got some scat from around the property. They say that if you introduce the scat, the droppings from the animals that live in the area, you're going to be introducing the bacteria from the area into your worm farm. And that can help it be a lot more bacterially, microbially diverse, and therefore make it a much healthier mix of microorganisms to put into your soil. Put cardboard in here, tissues, cooking paper, vegetable scraps, greens from the garden. I don't feel the need to chop it up. The worms do a good job of doing that for me, and I can show you what each layer has looked like. So clearly this one on the top is the one that we are actively adding to at the moment. This is layer number 2. You can see there's some castings in there. There's also some larger pieces of paper and cardboard that haven't been decomposed yet. The worms are really enjoying banana. You can see some of the rest of God's cleanup crew in here too, in the coffee ground and on that, which could be an avocado skin. Here is some more scat that was in this layer. You can see the worms have loved that and broken it down. Layer 3. Lots of worms in here. You can see a lot of plants are trying to regrow, some volunteer tomatoes, and these are probably pumpkin seeds. It's quite warm here. Layer 4. There's a lot more broken down matter in here. You can see a lot more of the typical worm castings, these little granules. Sometimes you see them on the lawn after rain, or when rain is approaching. After rain, they're often washed away. There's still some paper here that hasn't been decomposed, and some here. I'm not terribly worried about that. I still think it holds moisture, and it'll still contribute to the moisture holding properties in the soil. And the microbes in the soil can finish breaking it down when they get there. This is layer 5. It's really clearly more castings and less that hasn't been decomposed. The worms have eaten most of the things in here, broken them down. You can see a big piece of timber in here. Well, not big, but a decent sized piece of timber in here. This was put on our burning pile, but it wasn't burnt properly, so I popped it in the worm farm as an experiment. I'm just keeping an eye on it and seeing how it goes. I could put that in a planting hole along with other compost. I believe it'll be full of the nutrients and the liquid from the worm castings, so it would still hold a lot of moisture and it would give the roots something to hang on to. Still some plants trying to survive. This is layer 6, the bottom layer of my worm farm. You see there's some eggshell here that hasn't been broken down. There are lots of worms. I suspect they're entwined there for mating purposes. Can you hear the sound of the worms and the other creatures moving in the castings? So this is what I've come for this morning. This worm casting is going to go in my potato bed as I plant my potatoes this morning. So what I choose to do at this stage is to put it on top of the pile with the lid off. Worms don't like the sunlight, and so that will encourage them to race down out of this layer to the lower layers. And then hopefully when I put this on the garden, I won't take all my worms out of my worm farm. Composting worms like you'd find in the worm farm, they're generally tiger worms. Tiger worms need a very moist environment to live. You can see this environment is very moist. The ground in my vegetable garden is not that moist at all. And tiger worms would likely die if they were in that dry environment. So I choose to let most of them stay in the worm farm. There will be some that get in the garden and there will be some that survive. They always have survived in the garden for me, wherever I have gardened, but they do best in here and I want them to be doing their work in here, so I'll let them be in here. This is the bottom of my worm farm. You can see there's some leachate in here. I put quite a lot of water through the worm farm yesterday. I drained off what was easy to get. The rest of this has drained through the worm farm overnight. You can see the worms don't like the sunlight. They're all racing to get down into the water because they want to get away from the light. Why is light a problem for worms? Well, quite simply, worms can't survive when their skin dries out. So they would much rather be in the water and away from the light so that they know they're not going to dry out. You see the piles of castings on this surface here. That is actually an air surface. You can see the holes in this one, allowing air to come up into the worm farm, allowing heat to escape. And it comes up underneath each layer of the worm farm. When I change levels of the worm farm, I'm actually grateful for the water in the bottom because it holds the whole structure still so it doesn't move around when I'm putting layers on and off. And then I'll drain it into here. When I'm putting layers back on to the worm farm, particularly the bottom layer, I need to be very careful that I scrape everything off the bottom or it gets washed down into the base and it clogs up the tap. And then I have to take it all off again, and I don't particularly feel the need to lift everything off again. So I'll scrape the bottom of that along the top of this next layer. That will clean it enough that there won't be any items that will wash into the bottom reservoir and then clog my tap. So now my worm farm layers are all back on top of each other. Let's just disturb the soil here and just see how many worms are around. As I dig deeper, you can see there are lots of worms in there. Well, that looks like some turmeric that sprouted. Lots of worms. So by disturbing the soil, it makes them want to move away from the disturbance and it will encourage them to go down to the lower level, which will make it easier for me to make use of this without taking all the worms out. Each level has a perforated base and that allows the worms to come up and down between the levels. And in this case, I want them to all go down. There's still some items not quite decomposed, but I don't mind that because I'm going to be using this in the ground. I know there's going to be a lot of microorganisms in the ground that will make use of that. There's a lot of eggshells still in here. And I don't mind that because I believe there's a lot of calcium in eggshells that will still be used by the plants. And somehow the microorganisms will break it down and that calcium will become available to the plants. So we'll leave that open and exposed to the air and light and encourage the worms to go down. So here's my worm farm. It's been sitting out for about half an hour, maybe longer, just trying to encourage the worms to go down the bottom. Let's see how many worms are still in here. Oh, there are fewer than they were before. Okay, there's still some. I'm not too worried about that. I mean, some of them will have gone down to the next level. I'll scrape the castings off the top and maybe I'll only use the castings on the top because that's where the worms have mostly left. I probably shouldn't plant the sprouted turmeric. I have plenty of turmeric in the garden, but I think if I plant these, they're going to grow and I don't need any more turmeric right here, right now. I think I might just put them back in the worm farm for the next level. I've got some rhubarb I want to plant today, and so I'm getting some more worm castings to put around the rhubarb plants as I plant. Yesterday when I had a look at the worm farm, this big piece of timber is still in here. And as I move it this morning, they're mostly gone now, but when I first moved it, there were so many worms immediately under the timber. It seems that they like being around the timber, that they like coming up to it. And I wonder if in the ground, worms might do the same thing. So when there's organic matter, particularly timber, do they hang around more under the timber? If I disturb the surface here, you can see some of the worms that were hiding under the timber. Just so many worms in that space immediately there. So I'm going to continue to leave this piece of timber in my worm farm and just observe what happens.